always worse than we think it will be, and how it traps the soldier, no longer the hero, in a field of force of overwhelming violence, a place where his freedom of action is less than ours, where death is arbitrary and everywhere. What had happened in 1914 to 1918, Fussell argued, happened again in later wars whose narrators built on the painful achievement of the soldier riders of the Great War. Men like Owen, Sassoon, Rosenberg, Gurney were thus sentinels, standing in a long line of men in uniform who were victims of war just as surely as the men they killed and the men who died by their side. Paul Fussell had his ironic moment during the Battle of the Bulge, which no one had anticipated in its ferocity and daring. When the German thrust began and the shells hit, he was with a sergeant who had taught him how to be an officer and how to take seriously his responsibility for the young soldiers under his command. He owed everything to that sergeant. "Until the day I die," he said when we met in Germany, "I will tell anyone who wants to hear how much I owed him." The two men hit the ground during the bombardment, and in a moment or two, only one of them stood up. Fussell dedicated the Great War and modern memory to this soldier, whose death so easily could have been his own. Fussell remained a survivor with a sense of the fragility of life. Returning home with 2 Purple Hearts will do that to a man. It also made him intolerant of civilians gung-ho about war, and, in particular, about the Vietnam War. He told me once that he wrote The Great War and Modern Memory because he was disgusted with the conversations of neighbors at cocktail parties in Princeton, New Jersey, where he lived at the time, about body counts during the Vietnam conflict. They had no idea how blind and obscene were their smugness and their arithmetic. I recall a similar incident of civilian hauteur about casualties. The Harvard historian Oscar Handlin told an audience in Jerusalem in the 1970s that only 50,000 men had died in Vietnam. Someone asked him if he actually meant to say only 50,000 American men had died in the conflict. The Vietnamese had dropped off the face of the earth. That is how little he knew of the monstrousness of war. Fussell and Handlin would not have seen eye to eye. Paul Fussell was both an angry and a witty man. He was drawn to the poets and novelists of the Great War in Britain, in part because they were, like him, truth-tellers about war. But his earlier work on Augustan poets of the 18th century predisposed him to the delights of irony and the savagery of words usefully applied to the cruel masters of the world. His later work as a critic of American cultural life owed as much to Swift and Dryden as it did to the war poets of 1914 to 1918. Fussell's great book on the Great War appeared a year before another path-breaking study, The Face of Battle, by the late Sir John Keegan, then a young historian at Sandhurst. They both departed from official history or nostalgic history, which dominated publications before them, and helped us enter the mental world of the men who fought. They thereby moved the whole field in a tragic direction, one in which all soldiers were both the agents and the victims of war. Keegan asked a simple question: how is battle possible when it is so terrifying? His answer is that it is not always possible, and by July 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, it was evident that hundreds of thousands of men had been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. At Agincourt, men could run over to the next field to escape the terror of combat. In Waterloo, they could arrive late. But what could they do on the Somme or at Verdun, where they were trapped in a huge killing field with no escape to be had, and with a greater density of lethal objects hurled at them than the world had ever seen before? The Great War and Modern Memory is Paul Fussell's enduring account of the literary record of that moment in the midst of the Great War, when industrialization changed the character and killing power of the war, when it became something monstrous, and when that monstrousness left a literary legacy which has endured to this day.